Today, my guest is Ken Jacobson. He's the Deputy National Director of the Anti-Defamation League in New York. Welcome to the program, Ken. Good to
Good
see
to
you.
be with you, Stewart.
Thank you.
We go back a long way.
We do, certainly do. So I was interested in a column you wrote talking about devaluing people are devaluing the meaning of the word genocide, and talking about that in connection with the Holocaust. Can you rephrase or just tell us what you
Well,
said?
so it really was intended to sort of clarify things surrounding the way people are hearing both about current events and about the connection to the Holocaust. There are many, as we all know, when we talk about the Holocaust, we in the Jewish community have great fears that young people don't really know anything, that because it's so long ago that people don't emotionally connect to it, and the survivors are passing away. And so we talk about all the things that have to be done to compensate for what has been lost. And we know it's a great challenge. But now there's this additional challenge, which is this idea of projecting what Israel is about as, after all, the successor country to the survivors and others from the Holocaust, ironically, to be guilty of the same kind of thing that the Nazis did. So projecting onto the Jews and the state of Israel the guilt that is. And I've talked about this for years. Whenever we see these kinds of things, and it's much stronger today, it's very calculated. It's not something that just arises out of. It comes out of the need for so many who realize that there was tremendous guilt and anger about what the world failed to do to save the Jews of Europe, to basically say, well, if we committed this great sin of either supporting the Nazis or at least not opposing them, now the Jews are guilty of the same thing. And so it's a kind of moral equivalence, a canceling out. We had our Nazis, you have your Nazis. That to me is the very calculated point of this. It's also an effort to delegitimize the Jewish state, but I think specifically related to the Holocaust, I think it's a calculated effort to say there's moral equivalence, and therefore when there's equivalence, we no longer are guilty of what took place. So I think that's the overriding thing. We can get into the specifics, but I think
Right.
that is the overriding theme that I wrote about.
So the idea that the Jews are doing the same thing that the Nazis did. I mean, that's basically what's being said, correct?
Yeah,
Oh,
right.
right.
This is the most extreme sin in human society, committing genocide, which is the calculated murder of another people simply because of who they are, which is what the Nazis had in mind and committed against the Jewish people.
And we're seeing that today. The ICE agents. When we watch the TV, people say, "Oh, Nazis! They're Nazis." That term is being used, or they're saying, that they're describing what's happening as in similar terms.
Yeah,
Using these terms.
I think what you're pointing out there is another kind of challenge. I don't think it's the one that I really focused on in this piece, because the frequent use of the accusation of Nazis against people whose policies or manner or things you don't like is because people realize that this is the most powerful thing you could do, which is to accuse somebody of being like a Nazi. I mean, that's in effect a crime beyond anything. So I think, and we always, and others do as well, have said, don't simply make comparisons of whatever ills we have in society today to just recognize what the Holocaust was, the calculated, clear purpose of destroying the Jewish people, which they came very close to do. They destroyed 2/3 of the Jews of Europe. And whatever issue you're talking about now, it doesn't bear any resemblance. So that's another problem. But the problem of specifically calling out Israel and claiming that it's defensive war, by the way, first after October 7th,
Yes.
and now against Iran, to suggest that what Israel's purpose is to wipe out the people of Iran is so far from the truth that you again have to ask yourself what underlies the motivation for it. As I said, there are two major factors, it seems to me, that govern this situation. One is really a continuing effort by some to delegitimize the Jewish state. If Israel's guilty of genocide and should it exist, is claimed by some. And the other one, of course, as I just said, is a kind of canceling out of the moral reckoning. Jews now are guilty of the same thing the Nazis are in the eyes of those who accuse it. So that, I just think you raised a very important point that we talk about a lot, which is don't simply compare everything to the Holocaust, because that diminishes what really took place. So I think but I think it's a different category of things from what I was talking about with regard to the accusation against Israel. So
Yeah, and the term they call these guys Gestapo agents, right?
yeah,
Have you
yeah,
heard
well,
that? I mean, it
it,
baffles the
it's
mind,
very
really.
purposeful, and it's a crude way of avoiding any serious conversation and moral issues. I mean, look, if you get into the moral hypocrisy, there's so much of it, and you just don't. It all came out so clearly right after October 7th, before Israel even had a chance to militarily defend its country, when you
Yes.
saw people who should have been shocked by whatever your political views, what took place on October 7th that should have shocked every decent person, and it didn't happen that way. So,
No, the day afterwards, in Times Square, New York, they were
right,
marching with
right.
signs against Israel.
And right. Well, basically, what they were saying, without always, some people actually did say it, is Israel got what it deserved. That's what they were saying. What happened there? 1,200 people, innocent people, were murdered, women were raped, hostages were taken, all of which Israel deserved. That was the message they were conveying, and of course. This is the most horrendous thing. But so it's an extension of the reaction October 7th. Now that Israel's going after Iran, we're hearing this all over again. And I wrote a piece also on the subject of the anniversary of the Iranian Revolution. I wrote this piece about a month ago, which was when the anniversary of the revolution, as you know, took place in 1979. And I basically referred to it as the most disastrous moment in the world over the last 4 or 5 decades, because the implications of that revolution and I think people need to understand that when they're rushing to be so critical of this war, because they don't really understand how horrendous that revolution was, first to its own people, as we saw with the demonstrations and the murdering of thousands. We don't know how many thousands, the numbers are, you know,
I heard 36,000.
they do anything. And then, as I point out in the piece, the impact, the whole Islamic terrorism, while it always wasn't directly connected to the Islamic Revolution, it was the Islamic Revolution and the formation of the Islamic regime in Iran that gave legitimacy to all the movements in the region. While ISIS and Iran were never partners, it was the very idea of the Islamic State that gave strength to ISIS and led to our September 11th. So it seems to me that all of the most terrible things that have happened in the world over the last 40, 50 years can somehow or other, directly or indirectly, be traced back to the Iranian Revolution of 1979. And people need to understand that. I mean, again, whether you're for the war or not for the war, at least understand this wasn't a mindless kind of thing. When they brutally murdered so many thousands of demonstrators a few months ago, it was a clear sign that we can't just sit by. Trump said it at the time, we're going to help you. Well, it wasn't clear what that was going to mean, and you could agree or disagree with the fashion in which they've done it, but at least understand what we are dealing with here. This was the most destabilizing force in the world, that revolution of 1979, and that's the context for what's happening now.
Yes, absolutely. We're recording this in the beginning of March of 2026, and the fighting is still going on. But what I noticed was that the Israel, of course, is being attacked. I mean, we've seen rockets fired there. But the idea that people say this was a war fought for Israel,
Yeah.
and they say that in a snide kind of way. Are you hearing that as well?
Oh yeah, for sure. Well, of course, at ADL we monitor all these, social media, others, so when we continually we're seeing this kind of thing. We hope it doesn't get worse, and I think a lot of it will depend on how the war goes. If more Americans are murdered, you're going to hear more and more of that because the anti-Jewish, anti-Israel forces see a real opportunity with that. They will see this as an opening to blame everything on Israel, and people will say that doesn't sound so crazy. So, and the real point is that Israel and America had a common interest that, in my view, well-meaning, civilized people all over the world should share that interest, which is we need to weaken, deter, and hopefully overthrow this Islamic regime. The world will be forget about the Jewish issues. The world will be a safer place for the people of Iran, for the chances of advancing peace with the Arabs. So many things are possible if this regime disappears. And so we should not see this simply as Israel understood that its very existence could be at stake with the nuclear issue. And it was protecting itself without a doubt. But in doing so, it was in effect advancing the possibilities on so many levels of bringing us to a better world. And so, we've got to repeatedly make that point and not be embarrassed that Israel's cooperating with the United States. It's actually, in my view, one of the great moments that there's such coordination between the two countries. They weren't looking for war, but and when they would have preferred that the protests by the Iranian people would have translated into a different Iran, but instead it was slaughter. And you can simply say, well, America, what is it America's business? That's what you're hearing from some people. Why are we risking America's money and lives for this? And of course, that is the most, backward or kind of thinking that makes no sense whatsoever. So I can't say America has rushed to war. After all, there were these negotiations, but we know the history of this Islamic
Right.
regime, and they're not really serious. So.
When your column about the Holocaust, and you were making the point that the connection to the Holocaust is that it's seen as understanding the murder of 6 million Jews could not have happened without a deeply embedded racist anti-Semitism that that poisons the atmosphere in Europe. So this idea that there is anti-Semitism, I guess, just below the surface. That
Well, I was making that point in the context of the second great charge against Israel, which is the charge of apartheid. Now, apartheid, of course, was the system, the racist system that existed in South Africa before Mandela changed everything. So you could ask, well, why? How is this relevant? But the point is, apartheid is seen as the kind of symbol of racial hatred. It existed, it was institutionalized in South Africa. And in that sense, it's very much connected to what you just said, which is the Holocaust couldn't have happened if not for the centuries institutionalization of anti-Semitism. And so, you have, whenever we discuss the various factors in the Holocaust, we talk about the perpetrators, the Nazis, the collaborators, so many thousands and thousands all over Europe who helped the Germans, and the observers, the standby, who did nothing about it. All three of these groups, which made the Holocaust possible, were affected and infected with the anti-Semitism that really dominated European society for centuries. And so when you accuse the Israelis of apartheid, you're again doing not as badly as I would say the genocide charge, but still at a very high level. They're doing again the two things that I pointed out. You're saying the Jews are as bad as the racists of the world, and secondly, they're, illegitimate, and therefore Israel should go. So it's again this thing, and so these are the two most devastating words that you could accuse a society of: genocide and apartheid, and they're both being applied completely inappropriately to the state of Israel. You don't have to agree with every Israeli policy, but just look at the difference. Israelis, my family, I have nephews and great nephews and nieces who are in bomb shelters, 8 cents. They are, I'm talking about civilians. They are being targeted deliberately by the Islamic regime. Meanwhile, Israel, whenever they go after some military system, they warn the people in the neighborhood, get out. We don't want to hurt you. I mean, it's the most obvious thing. If anybody is objectively trying to say, are these two the same? You just can't avoid it if you're serious. So.
You also point out that as survivors die, as we get further and further from the war, the Holocaust, and the younger generation is not learning about it. Only a handful of states in the United States are requiring. What's the number? There's a number.
I don't know what the number
The
is.
low number
Yeah.
are requiring Holocaust education in the public schools.
Mm-hmm.
I'm afraid we're going to see more and more of this.
Yeah, well, look, it's a tremendous challenge. It's not only that people are not being exposed to what happened, but it's also, I always remember being in Germany, maybe 15, 20 years ago, a meeting with the one of the top German, I think the foreign minister or the secretary of state equivalent, and she was talking about how they educate their young people. And she said something that always stuck with me, which was the further away we get from what the events of World War II, you have to be much more creative to get young people to connect to what happened. In other words, not merely providing the information, you have to think creatively, ways that say, oh my God, I could have been there. I could, and so that's that's the challenge as well. It's not merely that there's not but you have to find ways to get young people to care about it. And you no longer, the most effective way was to have a survivor speak. We all know the survivors
Yes.
would come speak in schools. That would be the big, because it'd be so personal, and kids that never thought about it would do it. We no longer have those things. And so that's a tremendous challenge. And of course, the other thing is that in schools generally, history is not really taught, or kids don't seem to take history seriously. So you add that to the challenge as well. So there are tremendous challenges on many levels. But as I said at the beginning, now there's this new ingredient of accusing the Jews of being just like the Nazis. And
Yeah.
That
Well,
makes it even
yeah,
harder.
we had on the program just a few weeks ago Michael Birnbaum. He was the uh, historical advisor on the movie Nuremberg. In
Right.
Nuremberg, as you may recall, they showed clips from one of the concentration camps, and I said to him, I thought that was great because it it showed the people what really went on during the Holocaust. Even though it was brief, at least it gave a flavor of what happened. And
Yeah, but you can imagine Nuremberg, the trials took place a few years after, right after the
45. Yeah, yeah.
So people had lived through it, even if many of them didn't know really what happened. Today, it's ancient history for many people. You know,
And
it's
that's
like
why the movie I thought was great. But I thought the idea that movies, we can bring out movies that
yeah.
deal
So
with this, maybe be one way.
yeah, that you have to, as I say, you have to think creatively and not take it for granted that a simple education will do it. Though education is the beginning point. So.
Right. I was also struck by right after October 7th, I remember Israel responded and there was a bombing and the Palestinian a hospital was hit. And of course, the Palestinians immediately said, "Oh, this is Israel did this and whatnot," and the media picked it right up.
Yeah.
Media said, "Oh yes," and they went on for hours saying that this was an Israeli hit on this hospital. And of course, it turned out that it was a Palestinian missile that
Well, we saw this the other day, and if it's true, it's a very sad event. The Iranians are claiming that a girls' school was bombed and 150, 175 girls were murdered in that. Now,
yes,
the Americans are investigating, and the Israelis say they were not in that area. So I don't know. So we don't know all the facts, and if it happened, it's a terrible thing. But understand that that is the intention of the Iranians when they bomb Israel, which is they want to attack such civilian places, and that's what they're doing all the time. Thank God Israel has the anti-missile defenses, which have prevented the vast majority of the attack. By the way, imagine what life would be in Israel if they didn't have all these sophisticated defenses. And so, if it happened, and I hope it wasn't the Israelis or the Americans that it happened, but if it happened, it's a very sad thing and should be condemned for what it is. But I recognize that there's no intention by either the Americans or the Israelis to conduct themselves that way. And that the media failed to do, to make that distinction. They sort of throw it all together and say, oh, war is terrible. And both sides are deliberately killing civilians, which is just not true. So.
yeah. I see that the ADL's Jonathan Greenblatt, the CEO of the ADL, put out a statement because of what's going on, saying that there was concern witnessing an alarming pattern of escalating inflammatory rhetoric from voices across the political and ideological spectrum that distorts reality, fuels dangerous anti-Semitic
Yeah,
narratives.
we're monitoring it very closely. And as I said, we see signs of this, which is all focused on the idea that Americans are suffering because of Israeli expansionism. So that's the basic theme. It's going to play out as long as the war goes on. Hopefully, if things turn out in a positive way, I think the impact of those ideas will be diminished. If, however, God forbid, things turn in a negative way for whatever reason, whatever factors are involved, I think we'll see a tremendous increase in those kinds of ideas because, hey, one of the characteristics of anti-Semitism that we deal with, ADL, we're dealing with the issue all the time, and we're seeing it particularly since October 7th in a way that we haven't for decades, is that anti-Semitism, there's no monopoly from any ideology. It can come from the extreme left, it can come from the extreme right, and the idea that it's only one or the other doesn't make any. It's not proved to be true, and we're seeing it. I mean, there's no doubt that the people on the right have been friendlier to Israel in recent years than people on the left. But now we're seeing some of the old-fashioned anti-Semitism come from some notable figures on the right who are picking up on these ideas, exactly these ideas that America is suffering, America first, and America is suffering because of the all-powerful Jews. So we're seeing a return of some of that old stuff together with the new stuff coming from the left. And so, we have to take seriously these charges. We can't ignore them. We have to respond. We have to show how false they are and not take for granted that people are going to ignore them and not take them seriously.
Just, maybe 10, 15 years ago, the ADL would put out annual reports and say, well, the number of anti-Semitic incidents was up or it was down, these incidents, and what now we've seen record. I mean, it's off the charts.
We still do. We do
Yeah.
for all our regional offices. We turn out, and that's what's happened over the last few years. The number of incidents have skyrocketed. And yeah, look, the Jewish community has been traumatized since October 7th by what happened. They never listen. I did so much speaking and writing over decades, and I pointed out. I always do both the history of I used to do that every year for Catholic school teachers around the country. We had a program called Bearing Witness, and I would open the program every year with a 3-hour talk on the history of anti-Semitism and the role of the Catholic Church and about how things have gotten so much better. But I always would try to end by saying, look, we're living at a golden time for the Jewish community in America. The American Jews, I would say from around the 1970s till around 2005, 2010, were living in a period where, so many of our own people would say to us, why are you bothered about anti-Semitism? I've never experienced it was not only the most comfortable period for Jews in the world, but I would argue in the history of the diaspora going back 2,000 years, that the Jewish community in America just felt comfortable in its skin, so much so that, of course, the challenge became, how do you keep people Jewish if they're not under threat? And that has all changed. And I would always answer to them, so look, we like to say we played a role in this, in making things better, going back to the 50s and 60s. But I would always end my conversation with people who were asking these questions by saying, don't be complacent. And I would explain what anti-Semitism is about. And if the context changes in a way that opens up possibilities, you're going to see a recurrence of anti-Semitism. And unfortunately, it's happened way beyond anything that I thought would happen. And so, anti-Semitism serves a host of purposes beyond Jews, and Jews are the target because it works for the haters. And so we can never be complacent. We shouldn't be, it's been said by many, we need to use this moment to strengthen Jewish identity, which I completely agree with. And at the same time, we have to stand up against the haters. We have to do both. And that's what I think is what we're trying to do at this moment.
Great. Ken Jacobson, Deputy National Director and the Anti-Defamation League. Thank you. What a fast half hour. Appreciate you joining us.
Okay,
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. This has been Jewish Life. My name is Stewart Ain. Until next week, have a good one.